Lecture 6, Futures 202, Applying the Futures Sense of Foresight. So we've covered the foresight background for the future senses in Lecture 5. So we're going to look at applying now, the application as I see it unfolding. I don't want to focus on the standard futures tools simply because they can all do foresight, and as I've said in the earlier on in this course, it's not the tools themselves, because they're all about helping us work a foresight, futures, anticipation space with people, but it's actually more the focus on this futures feeling, which is what I'm about. So we're moving from futures thinking, which is the kind of conceptual background, to, let's say, foresight or memory or voice and optimism and yearning, as in the future senses, to applications, how really to ground it in our practice. That's what it's all about. So take a deep breath, and I'm going to go and share the desktop, which is very pretty. It's got the lovely futures cone there, which you were introduced to in Futures 101. And you know, it's as you'll see in what follows, we are working across these elements of futures visioning. The futures cone, which was developed by Joseph Voris, but it's not his creation in itself. He just deepened it and made it more user-friendly. So it's often attributed to Joe, who lives down in Ballarat, just outside of Melbourne, and was associated for a long time with the Swinburne University and so on. So take a deep breath and let's get moving, because it's been fun, as always, pulling together these lectures, or this lecture particularly. And what I did was I turned to a book that I read many years ago, makes me feel old, The Foresight Principle by Richard Slaughter. It's a terrific book. It's one of his better books, from my perspective at least, and of course he might be astonished to hear that. He might have his own favourites, as I'm sure he does, but you know, we're all entitled to our opinion, and you know, I've got a high regard for Richard's work. And of course I worked with him on the Futures Thinking for Social Foresight book that came out 2005, which was 10 years after this. When I was a very green futurist, really, if I could call myself a futurist, you know, I was asked to review his book, The Foresight Principle, is one of a set of foresight books that had come in to, I think, the Futures desk, Futures being the journal. So I happily immersed myself in this book, and some works by David Hicks and other books by Richard Slaughter as well. And so I'll be also referring to that. It's a little paper, a review paper you could call it, called From Foreboding to Foresight. But let's start here. I really like this. Foresight can be painful. I think, and this is 30 years ago, you know. So Richard Slaughter was looking at, you know, the work he'd done with foresight. He'd had, you know, quite an engaged, active life as a futures practitioner, or a futurist, foresight practitioner. He'd worked for the Commission of the Future and so on in Australia. And he'd also done work at Melbourne University and so on. So he had already, by this stage in his career, he's in his mid-40s or something, a really grounded understanding of the struggles of doing foresight. But he also made the point that foresight stands as the juncture between terror and promise. And I think that's also important, because that's a very human place to be. Right now, if we look around at the world and everything that's going on, that could be going on, that's wrong, we might be absolutely overwhelmed. But at the same time, we might look at all the promises that not just technology, but social imagination and growing social awareness and shifts in consciousness. It's also a time of promise. And that was probably what, you know, characterizes every moment in human history, in human consciousness evolution, you might say, that we stand between terror and promise. So these are 2 points that he made at the very beginning of the book. And then, you know, in one of my reflections about the book, in my own essay, which is this one's dated 2002, I make this point. Those methods and techniques which engage with a less analytic and more visionary process of futures are much more relevant to human progress because they actively involve the individuals in the act of futures building as opposed to futures scanning. And that's an important one because remember, so futures building obviously involves action. It's active, it's engaged, it's embodied. It's more about the feeling of the future and how do we generate, let's say positive feelings, but also how do we generate a sense of capacity to engage with the future as well. So that's in another article I've written called From Change to Progress, which was, again, still working very much with Richard Slaughter's ideas. Along with a bunch of other things, of course, but I'm not worried about those right now. So I'm looking at futures building. Futures scanning is what futures thinking, you might say, involves at some level. All the tools, futures triangle and so on, can easily be used to scan the current, past and futures contexts that we're looking at. And many of the tools that we touched on in Futures 101 are dealing with those things. So scanning is useful. It's a way of sense making and a way of wayfinding, but it's also on its own just a tool of inquiry, but it's not a tool, let's say, of transformative kind of capacity building. So what's needed here is imagination, of course. We keep coming back to it. So this is in my paper reflecting on Richard Slaughter's book and the other books that I mentioned. Reasons, rationality and analysis only carry us a certain distance. Okay, that's the scanning stuff, before they fade out into the irreducible uncertainty of the future. But imaginative and creative approaches are not limited in this way. And this is really important. They can leap ahead of the present, make seemingly outrageous assumptions and overturn the conventional wisdom of the day. In so doing, they help to free our minds from the limitations of the present and thereby opening up new ideas, options, new lines of inquiry and aspiration. So that was me in 1996, which makes me feel relatively antique right now. I go, oh my God, 1996. This young lady here was possibly not born yet. She's only 30, 31. So yes, she might have been, she would have been a young lass in her mum's arms. But I got her here because, of course, Phoebe Tickell is the founder of Moral Imaginations. This actually is a lovely talk that she gives on moral courage and imagination, activism. Activism is what we're on about. And if you feel for the future and you feel strongly, you will want to engage, okay, to do things. And of course, that's where Future's sense of voice comes in. So this is laying the foundations for that move to that perspective. Richard Slaughter, in his own book, The Foresight Principle, he says, what futures people do, and I've said this, of course, as well, is to look back and to derive insights, data, and knowledge about the past. That's me as my historian self. They interpret that knowledge and use it to approach their understanding of the present. You might say that's the sociological, anthropological, political science self, economic self, also aesthetic and cultural self. Within the present, they look carefully at structures and processes. We're looking around, we're analysing. On the basis of these observations, we look forward and create provisional knowledge about futures. That's my futurist self, or your futurist self too, for that matter. They are helped with the study of processes in the present by the work of many other people. In other words, God, look at that. That's a bad spelling mistake, isn't it? In other words, futurists are habitual skimmers, and that's really important because there's so much information out there. We cannot get our head around it all. You cannot read every book that you go and get because it's going to be useful. You actually turn to the book as a resource and you mine the book, okay? And that's really important to understand for your own mental health. So we've got these temporal coordinates before us. We look back, okay? We look around and we look forward. It's important. So why are we doing this? Well, Richard Slaughter talks about wise futures, and Oliver Markley talks about, Oliver Markley talks about wise futures. Richard Slaughter talks about wise cultures. I got it around the wrong way. Yeah, so Oliver Markley, I rely on his work quite a lot in this lecture, because he sort of lays out some of his own visioning techniques, and I touch on them. And of course, I'll also have a stack of his papers for you to go to, because he actually goes into a lot of detail on how he does his visioning work. And of course, you can take that and apply that in your own work. So wise futures may be envisioned as being ecologically sustainable, socio-economically just, psycho-spiritually fulfilling, and protective of the needs of future generations. So a wise futures is about generating futures that we can be proud of, futures that are secure, enabling, and rich for future citizens of the world, but also future animals, plants, even the ecology, geology, and so on. Wise cultures sits within that vision that Markley offers us. Higher awareness is not an illusion, says Richard Slaughter, but a constant inspiration and challenge. And of course, it challenges us because we're not getting there very easily, are we? It's always a struggle. It is refined, peaceful, and compassionate. I really like that. So that's Richard Slaughter in his 1995 book, Oliver Markley. Towards the end of his active futurist career, because he was working from the 60s and 70s in futures. He's still with us, but has pretty much withdrawn into his own. He lives on a sustainable community somewhere in California, I think. Anyway, we need to remember a few things. We need, as Richard Slaughter points out, to remember that human beings are, or can choose to be, agents of history. So this is where we are actors as a species and as an individual as well. Also in between as communities and so on. We also need to remember what Jose Ramos points out with Michelle Barnes and others in that fantastic book, The Cosmolocal Reader, of which that's also available in the reading library for this course. The current era is the birth of working together. Collaborative, in other words, at a planetary scale, for the common good of communities everywhere. And if you read that book, you'll realize that it's not communities, just human communities. It is the animal, vegetable, mineral as well. It's the entire lot. So back to Oliver Markley. Now, he's got this beautiful paper, Imaginal Visioning and Prophetic Foresight, and he offers early in that paper definitions for both. Imaginal visioning, he says, is the process of intuiting transcendentally supra-rational knowledge in a focused, receptive mode. So a lot of his work is about generating within a group, a collective, or even for the individual, an embodied breathing out, opening up, and becoming super attentive, but not in a directive way, but in a receptive way. So that's why he talks about transcendentally supra-rational knowledge. It's not rational. It's not built in the same way. It comes out of our feeling center, our heart center, you might say. And it leads to prophetic foresight. I've got more to say in later lectures about prophetic foresight because it links up with the work of Cornel West and so on, which is, I think, really interesting. He's an Afro-American liberation theologian, and his work's had quite an impact on me over the years. So what does he say about this? So he says, and there's a number in there that shouldn't be there, proactive knowledge is what prophetic foresight is. That includes a moral, ethical, or wisdom component. In other words, it's, in social science terms, it's normative. Often a vision of wise and unwise futures and ways to manifest or avoid them. Okay, so that's what prophetic foresight is. It's a particular kind of foresight. It's not the scanning foresight which we discussed above. It's the bridge building, futures building foresight. So where do we go? Well, this is from that paper, Visioning Futures, and I just chose one of quite a number of techniques that he Oliver Markley, that's the he offers us. I really like this because it touched on the daydream, the short-range future, the daydream. Okay, shifts one generation, 20 to 30 years into the future. We, the participants, are asked to imagine having tuned into a virtual reality television show that summarised the big events of that year, 25 years in the future. What are some of the things that this virtual reality television show are going to be showing us? And to consider questions such as, what progress has been made in dealing with problems such as growth in population, pollution, so forth? Then you might ask, what is now possible due to new technologies? You might ask that too. Then you could probe, what do people find important when they consider these types of problems? So that's his process. He sets it up in the context of the article by settling us. If we're sitting there, he might have us sitting in a circle. He might soften the lights. He will take us through a couple of simple instructions designed really to slow us down, to break the kind of the manic speed that our minds might be working at. We've all come rushing into the room to join the workshop, and we've got all the busyness going on. We'll turn off all our phones and all those sorts of devices that can distract us, and we enter the space. And then he says, okay, let's daydream. Let's just start thinking about that. Here, you're sitting in a room. He might ask you to feel what's in the room. What's happening in that room? Then you might say, who are you sitting with? And he says, what are you watching? You're looking at something on a screen. It wouldn't be the old big TV screen. It would be a flat screen, or maybe a totally virtual reality screen, like something in a sci-fi movie. What are you seeing on that? Are we seeing something about an ecological situation? It could be the triumph of the reintroduction of certain species to an area that had been really degraded through monocultural agriculture, or it might be something really bad, like the ongoing desertification of Central Europe, or wherever it is that you might live. And so he would work us through that process. So that's just one. So let's move on to another one. So another visioning strategy that he gives us is from the same paper later on. This is an interesting one because he actually offers us a tool that gets replayed in a different way in the work of the Long Time Academy, which I will be touching on shortly as well. So this is great. Carolyn Mace is a wonderful, really eclectic, holistic thinker. She is, in some people's minds, associated with the New Age movement, but she's not really that New Agey. She's much more, she's very scholarly. That's what I'd have to say. But I like her, and obviously Oliver Markley has followed her work for years. So he had a chat with her through some sort of personal communication, presumably over the telephone, or maybe even in a handwritten letter, because it's from 1979. And that's a fair while ago. There was no internet then, no email. And he says, look, based on some ideas that he picked up from Carolyn Mace, this guided cognitive imagery procedure, that's what he's calling it, cognitive imagery procedure, more or less simply involves the climbing of a very, very long circular staircase, in which, as you climb, you experientially unburden yourself. Be aware, imagistically, of having and then let go of the following sequence. That's a bit of a mouthful. Experientially unburden yourself. What of? Be aware, imagistically, of having something, some images of the future, the past, whatever it is, and then letting go of the following: possessions, My guitars, can I imagine letting go of them? Relationships, my children, my loved ones, my friends, my family. Emotional reactions, oh God, such and such said that to me, let it go. Judgmental evaluations, oh, they shouldn't be doing that, should they? They're mad, those guys. Let it go. Compulsive awareness of the physical body, oh, my knee hurts. Oh, well, got to let it go. The level of zone of probabilities, what might be, just let it go. Let go of possibilities, that future's gone. Let it go. Even of creative emergence, let it go. You might be seeing things that are exciting. No, just step back, step out, and into the experiential, embody the feeling awareness of source, that inner welling up of just awareness of being. It could be a spiritual source, or if you're an atheist, it could be a sense of your own deep, still, quiet self, so rarely touched on. And, he goes on, by reversing the direction and skillfully navigating in consciousness into alternative, possible, probable, preferable realities of interest. Domains such as that match the explorational concerns of the student, client, participant. Such much of great value can be intuitively experienced and learned simply through that process of letting go. We let go to make room for other possibilities, right? That's his whole point. And that's what Carolyn Mace was giving him, was this kind of a tool, guided imagery, walk up the stairs. In the case that I'm thinking of, that I'll touch on briefly in a few slides, is the long time project, which is linked to somebody, Ella Saltmarsh, whom I particularly admire. She's a wonderful thinker, sort of social activist and so on, in which they have a similar process, but there's a well, and you walk up to the well, and it's the well of time, the deep well of time, and you go into the well, you descend into the well, and you descend into, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 100 million years ago, and it's very much a physical, imagined sense of what it was like, and where are you, what are you seeing in those processes. So it's that sort of thing, and I think you can quite creatively design your own that suits the condition that you're working with. If you're working with an institution, let's say a business that's working on something in the IT sector, you could take them up that that staircase, and be prompting them with similar things. What are you letting go of? And so there are consequences, there are aspirations, there are also judgments, there's pressures, you have to let them all go, and there's also obviously possibilities. So you could design it for them, or you could design it for a community, where you take them up the staircase, letting go of other things. And it's all about then bringing people back to that experiential awareness of source. And so to repeat what he says here, by reversing direction, skillfully navigating in consciousness into alternative, possible, probable, preferable realities of interest. Okay? It's another technique. So it's all about the imagination, visioning, and the feeling that goes with it. Okay? So project-based foresight's important. Michel Godet, who's got this wonderful little article that I'm sharing with you as well, called Future Memories. And it's in a sense, it's his reflection on his career as a futurist. He says, the ability to motivate people in a common project and to manage change remains the springboard to building the future. So we have to motivate people in a common project. Of course, they might come to us and obviously be willing participants, but sometimes we'll find ourselves in contexts where we have to be futurists by stealth, offering insights, questions, ideas, suggestions, and so on to a group that might stimulate a movement towards, I guess, more proactive than rather reactive change. Anyway, the next 4 slides, I've got projects just to show you. So this is picking up on this, and they're all projects that are about action, okay, which is what I was saying early on in this lecture. So first one is the Long Now, not to be confused with the Long Time project. The Long Now project, Brian Eno and people like that are involved with this, and this is a little clip from their website. It's got the web link embedded in the clip, so you download the PowerPoint and you can go straight there, but it's pretty easy to find. If you didn't, you just Google the Long Now. The Long Now is a period of, let's say, 20,000 years, where here we are in the year 2000, and they're looking forward to the year 12,000 and back to the year 8000 CE. The 8000 CE, the glaciers start to retreat. We have the agriculture invented, inverted commas, around 7000 BCE. Then we have the first cities around 4000 BCE, so on. So they've got a timeline. Timelines, of course, are bread and butter for this sort of work, but I'm not touching on that. I'm more interested in the bigger, more effective stuff at this stage, the more effective processes. So that's one of the projects that are doing this kind of work, this visioning, working with imagination, ideas, but also skilling people with tools. A great set of tools comes out of the Afrofuturist movement. Ahmed Best, he's the guy that acted Jar Jar Binks, and he's really active in the sort of Afrofuturist movement, does a lot of work with people like Lisa K. Solomon in the Stanford University, where they have a design center. He has his own Afrofuturist podcast. He interviews really interesting, cool people there as well. And he's got, this is his a talk that he's giving on Feel the Future. I just thought, oh yes, he's talking my stuff, Feel the Future. So of course we have to feel the future, and it's not rocket science, and I haven't invented anything of import there. I've just picked up on the tone of the times. I want to move from thinking to feeling, because that's really where the juice sits. And for me, the juice is creative. This guy is extremely creative. He's working with novelists. Obviously, he works a lot in film. He does voicing for Hollywood movies and with all sorts of groups as well. He's an all-round, out there kind of guy. I think that's terrific. So from there, you know, let's jump to something even more imaginative. Solar punk. I love solar punk. I've got solar punk cities and other stories and so on. And you know, I was always intrigued by cyberpunk, but it didn't affect me feeling again like this. So solar punk is an important aesthetic and social movement in which alternatives are explored in rich and often playful ways. This is a link to the magazine on solar punk. That's a journal, that's what I say, and you know, that's just one of their one of the snips from their screen, which I particularly like because it's simple. Demand utopia. I don't know about that really, but it's fun to play with. The last of the projects I want to share with you is the one that I was talking about earlier, the Long Time Academy. Okay, the Long Time Academy is a wonderful set of resources actually. And they do the Well of Time resource. They do the tool that Marguerite was using in lecture 4, where we were looking at her introduction, where she was leading us through her introduction into the futures collage work, where she said, you're standing up, and you take one step forward, and you're, you know, 30 years older, you take another step forward, and you're you're 90 and you're surrounded by all your grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. And then the same thing, you step back. That's what the Long Time Academy offers us. That's, I think, their first visualization. The second one is the Well of Time, and then there are other processes as well. They involve kind of online virtual yoga breathing and so on to still you and bring you into greater receptivity, which is exactly the visioning work that Oliver Markley was seeking to describe there. So there are some really useful online tools that have enriched my thinking, and I would hope if you go and explore them, they'll enrich your thinking, because the future sense of foresight needs to be moved out of the typical foresight work that you might do in scanning and being strategic into this much more effective domain, which is quite aesthetic, it's quite visual, it's very sensory. So these are, I guess, tools that enable. Something that's really important though, and that's what was talked about by Jose Ramos in his interview in Futures 101, where he reflects on the inner game, as he calls it, of futures work, and he reflects on journaling and how journaling transformed his ability to understand his own relationship with the future. He says, my journal topics were wide-ranging and often experiential. So, that's me slipping up there, experimental. They would often be chronicles of the day's events, reflections on people, grappling with my own feelings, or cataloguing goals and aspirations and just about whatever emerged. On a day-to-day basis, the process of journaling was emotionally grounding. I think that's really important. But it also had the more powerful effect of helping me to tap into a deeper sense of life purpose, as well as develop skills in self-observation. Journaling led me to a very deep inner conversation about my and our collective human existence. So that paper he wrote in 2015, quite autobiographical. He's in terms of his relationship with futures. He talks about how he got into futures, the role that Sahel and Ayatollah played in pointing him in the right direction, his great relationship with the Houston School of Futures and so on. So he kind of lays it all out there, but journaling is very key to that. And I think we need, and this is where let's say the futures mirror comes in as well, that we need ways to reflect upon ourselves that provide some distance and yet remain intimately personal to us, because it's we before anything else need to be able to conduct the transformative at an internal level. It's never finished. There's no goal as in an end point, apart from death maybe, but there's no goal there other than that the process keeps growing, that we constantly renew ourselves in our own self-knowing, that transcendental, that transformative, that deeply personal process there. Journaling is also really good for identifying those aspects of that are sort of suppressed and hidden in the shadows that may shape our responses, particularly our emotional responses. Back to images. So here's this interesting one. So Oliver Markley, as a young guy working with Willis Harman, who's one of the great sort of foresight figures of the 20th century, died, 1980 something, I think. He was a mentor for Oliver Markley for sure, and they produced a really interesting book called Changing Images of Man, 1982. I love that use of the word man there, but on the very first page they make this fantastic point. The kinds of educational systems and goals a society sets up, the ways in which it approaches the problems of material distribution, poverty and wealth, how it treats the welfare of its citizens, the priorities it gives to various human needs. All these aspects and many more are affected by the image of humankind that dominates the society. Precisely how we cannot say with detailed accuracy, which is why metaphors and myths, allegories, theories, all of which attempt to express an image, are useful. But in a very real way, all policy issues are issues relating to fundamental assumptions about the nature of man and his concerns, or the nature of humanity and our concerns. This is why the CLA is such a powerful tool, for instance, because it goes right down to those metaphors, myths, images, allegories, and so on. we need to understand that this kind of foresight work that we're doing, the visioning work, the imaginal visioning work, the prophetic foresight work that Markley's pointing at, is drilling down into this kind of deep cultural memory work, so it's memory, in order to enliven, through prophetic foresight, human potential in order to transform the way we respond to the world around us. In real ways, our actions change. Where do we go? Well, I think we turn to Jim Data, don't you, for advice. So good old Jim. He says, look, just do it. The simple answer is just do it. You have my permission, says Jim, to be creative, wild, outlandish, brash, bold, perhaps absurd, all of which I have to say I'll do my best at. And then to be practical, realistic, and down to earth. Creative in the more literal sense of creating, bringing into being your wild and outlandish ideas in a way that then makes sense to others. And that's what I've worked at all my life, is how to make sense to others. That's why I think of foresight and futures work as bridge building. So it appeals to them, satisfies their needs, your needs, people doing this course, and concerns. So just do it. Well, that's exactly why I started doing the course this year. And that was before I went. I have had this paper stashed somewhere, and I can't cite it because I don't know where I got it from. It's an untitled paper just with number 3 written at the top. So presumably it's part of some sort of collective thing. I've emailed Jim and said, Jim, tell me, where does it come from? But I haven't heard back yet. When I do, I will add the reference to this reading, or to this lecture, should I say. So he goes on, same paper. So he says some techniques for unleashing or enhancing creativity are the following. Brainstorming. Well, that's a no-brainer, but it's also really important to remember. Brainstorming, that's tossing things up on a mirror board if you're using a device, or just on the wall with post-it stickers if you're using the old-fashioned ways. Quickly generating as many different metaphors and analogies of things as possible. Asking how many things, you can do with a pen other than write with it. What can you do with a pen? Scratch your ear, and all that sort of stuff. Reversing everything so that your state, for example, airplanes should land upside down, or wheels on automobiles are square. Just remember his reversal of the word nostalgia last week in the lecture that I gave you. So he reversed the word, and that's not from this paper, by the way, but it's an example of Jim practicing what he preaches. He also looking at things from different angles, literally and figuratively, perhaps becoming the thing itself, getting inside it, as well as on top of it and around it, asking how does it feel, smell, sound, all that sort of stuff. The thing from the future stuff that Stuart Candy does such a great job with. Using random inputs, just putting together 2 or more things that aren't normally connected. That's the kind of work that you get in a lot of the card games around the future, which I'm going to touch on quite soon. Permitting no dichotomous, either or, black and white choices. Okay, it's not A or B, right or wrong. There must be more than 2 solutions. Could be called, some sociologists were using this in the 1990s, the third way. I think that's too simplistic, but there's got to be other pathways. It's not Israel wins, Gaza loses, Israel loses, Gaza wins. Got to have much more in between stuff happening there. The greys that make life real, okay? So these are the sorts of suggestions that Jim Data is making in regarding the foresight process or practice, and for me it's the foresight sense that we're developing here. Sherman Cruz, with some of his colleagues, developed the Dreams and Disruptions game. This is an active website as well, I think, is it? It's not. I don't know why not. I must have forgotten to add the link to that one. But anyway, it's easy to find. You just Google Dreams and Disruptions and you'll find his cards. And you've got these cards, the archetype card, the preferred future, the weird future, the worst future, and so on. And these cards are laid out in in a process, so that you're forced to do, flick back to Jim for a moment, you're forced to do looking around, looking at different angles, reversing everything, changing things around, rethinking the elements of the world that we're sitting in. And this is all, of course, what gaming is all about, the gaming of the future. And then, what can I say? Well, for me, in my own work, what are some of the things that I do? Well, when I was in Sweden one time, we had a great time playing with the Futures Triangle, where we embodied it. We had 3 groups of people, one for each corner of the triangle, and we embody the triangle, and we've also done it with CLA, and we voice for the weight of the past. We voice the pressure of the present, or the push of the present. We voice the pull of the future, and so on. My interplay work, dancing on behalf of, an amazing process when we tell stories about the past or the future or the present, and we dance on behalf, and we big body story them. These are processes, of course, that we will probably have to look at, or I'll have to find a way of communicating them to you. They are fantastic processes. None of this is rocket science, but it does involve getting, for some people at least, out of their comfort zone. Dancing on behalf of is where you might tell me the story of some issue that you faced that you really never felt you resolved. It might have been a relationship that collapsed or something. And then when you've told me the story, or told us the story, because it might be 2 or 3 people involved, we then, to some music that's kind of serendipitously chosen usually, we do a dance for you, and we dance on behalf of that. It could be that pain, that exaltation, that bemusement, whatever it might be. In a sense, you could say that's making ritual, because of course dancing on behalf of is ritualistic. But I really like to make ritual, and I've got some I'm always working on elements of ritual in my own practice, my own life as well, for that matter. And then looking at mythic memory, playing with stories from 2500. What will people 5 centuries from now be telling us about us? How mythic will it be, depending on how the society goes? How literalistic will it be, because they've got all the, the film footage and everything, the daily news stuff on what was happening in the world, what was happening in the Ukraine, the US, Australia, Europe, drones over Denmark, or whatever it might be. Okay, they've got all of that. But will they be literalistic, or will they be reading it from different perspectives that we can hardly even yet imagine? Working collaboratively is something that I do as much as I can. I love to do that. Some of you would know that I'm working on One Day in 2050 on editing books and contributing to books that they produce, for instance. End up in some great conversations with those guys. So that's worth looking at, and thinking about your own practice is how to be collaborative. You don't go it alone. It's much less rewarding, I can tell you. We curate conversations. For me, that's often in my edited books, but it's also in my teaching. I keep my teaching alive, both in the university and now here with Futures 101 and 202. I keep it alive because the conversations that arise are amazing. And then, of course, there's the wayfinding work. That's me walking, but me also, it just seems to happen. I'm luckily working with Jasmine Zhang at the Uppsala University in SLU in Sweden on a project of environmental communication and environmental futures work through wayfinding using pilgrim trails, pre-Christian Viking trails, ecological trails as well, and running them through the futures senses. So that's a really fun thing to do. And then, of course, what's this? You might be saying, Kia whakatamori, te haura whakamua. That's Maori. That's from New Zealand. And it says walking backwards into the future. And it's a beautiful image of, I guess, my thinking around and navigating the ruins of the future, which is my metaphor. And of course, working with creative and visual people. This image on the side here, it's Time. That's a poem that I wrote. And a friend of mine, Linnea Humble, who's attended Masters courses at University of Uppsala. That's where she met me, or I met her. We've teamed up a number of times now in creative visual processes where I provide some writing and she provides some visual reference points for it. So again, it's shifting it out of just words, out of just thinking, into a kind of much more effective and emotive space. So my last point then would be that many hands are needed and there are many paths. It's not a straight line between the future sense of memory and the future sense of foresight. They cohabit. They are literally two sides of a sheet of paper or a coin, whatever your metaphor might be, and that the mind is the cosmic mind that we are playing a role within. Each one of us counts, and that's so important for me. So the future's sense of foresight is a gift to us all to become more, I guess Jim Data would say, more courageous, more out there, more experiential, take risks, and at the same time find our tribe. Who do we play with? How do we play? Because we've got to be safe. So that's important. And of course there is a reference list because I used too many different things this time, and I thought it's unfair expecting you to go off and find them all higgledy-piggledy underneath the slides. So I ended up throwing them in here. I hope I haven't forgotten any other than the Jim Data one that I couldn't reference because, of course, I don't know where it came from. But when I find it, I will make it available to you all. So I'll take a deep sigh and jump back here. So thank you very much for following my line of flight, you might say. I hope you go and try some of the activities. As I said, the readings, particularly the ones from Oliver Markley, are going to be useful. The Jose Ramos reading, Jim Data gives those points, and I will put up the paper, even though I don't know where it comes from. So there's a lot of resources there. And of course, there's the bread and butter resources, Futures Triangle, Three Horizons, scenarios. I didn't even talk about scenarios, and yet they're so much part of the imaginal visioning process, actually. But the imaginal visioning comes first, and then the scenarios flow out in a much more creative and coherent way, I think. So maybe I should slap my hand for not having put scenarios in, but I didn't. So that's life. And I thank you so much, and I will talk to you again in our workshops, and I look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.